Every year, millions of Africans travel to Europe, America, Canada, and the Gulf in search of a better life. They carry the hopes of entire families on their backs. They send money home every month. They work 3 jobs to pay rent in cities that were never built for them. Some of them make it big abroad, but many don't, at least not in the way anyone expected. This series tells the stories of those who came home appearing to have failed, only to build something greater than anyone could have imagined. It is a series about shame, silence, reinvention, and triumph. It is about the Nigeria waiting for people when they return, full of opportunity that outsiders cannot always see, and the extraordinary human beings who turned humiliation into a legacy. Each episode is structured as a dramatic narrative arc. The protagonist is always someone who appeared to fail abroad, returned home to ridicule or quiet embarrassment, and then built something remarkable. The storytelling borrows from the tradition of documentary filmmaking. Tension is built slowly, emotional beats are respected, and the payoff is earned. The series works because it mirrors the private fears and private dreams of an enormous audience. Every Nigerian with a relative abroad, or who is themselves abroad, will see themselves somewhere in these stories. Episode 1. He returned from the UK with nothing. 5 years later, he owned an entire estate. After 14 years in London, Tunde stepped off the plane in Lagos with just 2 suitcases and less than £200 left in his bank account. His friends laughed. His relatives whispered that he had been deported, that he had failed, that all those years away had produced nothing. They saw a man in his late 30s with no job, no savings, and no plan. Nobody knew the truth. 5 years later, those same people stood outside the gates of an estate with more than 120 houses, waiting for one man, the same man they once called a failure. Tunde was 24 years old when he boarded his first flight. He had studied engineering at a polytechnic in Ibadan and graduated with a decent result, but the Nigeria of his 20s offered him very little. He had watched his cousins struggle for years in jobs that paid almost nothing. He had seen men with master's degrees riding Okadas and men with PhDs teaching secondary school for 40,000 naira a month. London felt like the answer. A distant uncle had helped with the visa paperwork. The family had pooled money together to pay for his flight and his first few months of accommodation. His mother had prayed over him for 3 nights straight before he left. He arrived in winter in a city that was nothing like the one he had imagined. The London in his head had been bright and full of opportunity. The London he landed in was expensive, cold, and indifferent. But Tunde was not easily discouraged. He was 24 and optimistic and hungry. He told himself, "I will work hard, save money, invest, and within 5 years I will be a wealthy man." That was the plan. Life had different ideas. The first year was the most disorienting. Tunde found work quickly enough, cleaning offices at night, stacking shelves at a supermarket during the day. Between both jobs, he was working nearly 16 hours a day. He slept in a room he shared with 2 other Nigerian men in Peckham, paying £450 a month for a single bed and a wardrobe. He sent money home every month without fail. His mother needed support. His younger sister was in secondary school. There were cousins who needed school fees. There were hospital bills that arrived without warning. Tunde became the family's lifeline the moment he landed in London, and that lifeline was expensive to maintain. Here is the quiet crisis that no one talks about loudly enough. The average Nigerian abroad does not live like an expatriate. He lives like a soldier, carefully, strategically, sacrificing almost everything in the present for a future that keeps getting pushed back. Every time he saves a little, something urgent pulls the money back home. A funeral, a medical emergency, a younger sibling's university fees, and in London, the costs are relentless. Rent, transport, food, tax, phone bills, the occasional cost of visiting a doctor. The British system is efficient, and it is expensive, and for a man working minimum wage jobs, it leaves very little room to breathe. By his 3rd year, Tunde had managed to save a modest amount, but he was also exhausted in a way he had not anticipated. He had aged. He was cooking for himself at midnight after a night shift, ironing his uniform at 5 in the morning before an early start, and trying to stay awake on public transport so he did not miss his stop. He had expected to struggle. He had not expected to struggle for this long. And then something shifted. He got a better job, an administrative role at a logistics company, something closer to his training, something that paid considerably more than his cleaning work. He began to stabilize. He took evening classes. He was promoted once. Life felt like it might finally be going somewhere. Then the company he worked for restructured. His role was made redundant. Being unemployed in London without savings is not merely inconvenient, it is terrifying. Rent does not pause. The city does not wait, and Tunde, now in his late 30s, found himself doing calculations in a small room in South London that all came back to the same answer. The numbers did not work. He applied for jobs. He was told he was overqualified. Applied for lower jobs. He was told he was too old. He sent his CV to dozens of companies and heard back from very few. The months passed. He stopped sending as much money home. For the first time in 14 years, he called his mother to explain that he could not send what he usually did. That conversation, quiet and dignified and full of things that were not said, changed something in him. He began to think seriously about returning. It was not a simple decision. Returning felt like surrender. Every Nigerian who has spent years abroad understands this. Going back is not merely a travel arrangement. It is an announcement. It is a declaration that you tried and did not quite make it in the way everyone hoped. There is shame attached to it that no one discusses openly, and that everyone feels privately. But Tunde was pragmatic. He had always been a practical man, even when practicality was painful. He looked at his situation clearly. He was 40 years old, unemployed, nearly out of savings, and living in an expensive city that was becoming less and less hospitable. He had skills. He had experience. He had spent 14 years learning how businesses operate, how logistics work, how money moves through systems. He had something, even if it did not feel like it yet. He packed 2 suitcases. He booked a one-way ticket. He landed in Lagos, and then the whispers started. The Lagos that Tunde returned to was not the Lagos he had left at 24. It had grown in every direction. New roads, new malls, new gated developments appearing in areas that had been bush just a decade before. The energy was different, louder, more frantic, but also more alive with possibility than he had remembered. He moved in with his mother first, quietly. While he tried to understand what Nigeria had become, he noticed things with fresh eyes. The eyes of someone who had spent 14 years watching how a developed economy functions. He noticed the scale of housing demand. He noticed how many middle-class Nigerians were desperate for decent, affordable homes. He noticed how poorly coordinated the building materials supply chain was, how contractors paid inflated prices for cement and iron rods because they were buying from middlemen stacked 3 deep. He had seen supply chains optimized in London. He had watched logistics companies strip out inefficiencies and make fortunes from the margins. He began to wonder if the same principle could apply here. The whispers were still happening around him. People still spoke carefully when they saw him, that careful politeness that Nigerians extend to someone they believe has fallen. But Tunde was not listening to the whispers. He was listening to the market. He started small. With the modest savings he had left, he began buying building materials in bulk. Cement, iron rods, roofing sheets, directly from manufacturers and selling them to small contractors at prices that undercut the local hardware middlemen but still gave him a margin. It was not glamorous. It was unglamorous in every possible way. He was driving pickup trucks to construction sites in the heat, negotiating in dusty yards, tracking inventory in a notebook, but it was working. The key discipline Tunde imposed on himself was one that most people could not maintain. He refused to display anything he earned. No new clothes, no new phone, no celebrations. Every naira he made went back into the business. He bought more stock. He hired a driver. He opened a small store. He reinvested quietly and consistently while the people around him were still discussing his failure. This phase, the quiet grinding phase, is where most people who eventually build something great are invisible. The world only sees you when you arrive. It does not see the years you spent driving in the heat before the sun came up. 18 months after returning to Lagos, Tunde bought his first plot of land. It was a modest piece of land in an area that most people considered too far from the city center to be valuable. But Tunde had been watching the Lagos expansion, the way the city was spreading outward rapidly, the way Lekki and Aja had transformed within a single decade, the way land values followed infrastructure. He had a theory about where the city was going. He was right. He built a duplex on that first plot. It took him 8 months. He stayed involved at every stage, something his building materials business had trained him to do, negotiating with contractors, sourcing materials at the best prices, managing the timeline himself. The duplex cost him considerably less than it would have cost someone who had no direct access to materials at wholesale prices. He sold it before it was completed. The profit was not enormous, but it was real, and it was enough to repeat the process on a larger scale. He bought 2 plots, built 2 duplexes, sold them both, bought 5 plots. By the time he was on his 3rd cycle, he had attracted 2 investors, Nigerians in the diaspora who had heard about this man who seemed to build affordable properties quickly and profitably. They came to him with capital. He came to them with skill and connections. The partnership changed his scale entirely. He began to think in terms of developments rather than individual buildings. An estate, by definition, is simply many individual buildings managed as a single project. The economics of scale were dramatic. Buying land in bulk, building in phases, marketing units before they were completed, and using the deposits to fund the next phase. It was a cycle, and once the cycle was turning, it was difficult to stop. 5 years after landing at Murtala Muhammad Airport with 2 suitcases and less than 200 pounds, Tunde's development company had completed its first full residential estate. 122 housing units, affordable, well-built, and sold before the last phase was completed. He was not the wealthiest man in Lagos, but he had built something that would stand for a generation. One evening, Tunde drove to the street where he had grown up. He parked the car and sat for a while. He thought about the boy who had left at 24, full of dreams about London. He thought about the man who had returned at 40 with nothing but a clear mind and a willingness to work. Some of the neighbors came to greet him. A few of the relatives who had whispered the loudest were suddenly warm and effusive. There were handshakes and congratulations, and the particular warmth that people extend to someone who has succeeded. Tunde was gracious. He had chosen long ago not to carry bitterness about the period when they had doubted him. Bitterness is expensive, and he could not afford it then. He chose not to afford it now. He just smiled and said very little. Sometimes going abroad changes your life. Sometimes coming home does. The question is never where you are. It is always what you are willing to see. Future episodes. Episode 2. She returned from Canada. Broke, then built. Africa's biggest fish farm. Amaka spent 8 years in Toronto working in elder care. A job that paid well, but was physically and emotionally exhausting. After her mother's illness pulled her back to Anambra, she had to decide whether to go back to Canada or stay. She stayed. Using her savings and a government agricultural loan, she invested in aquaculture, catfish farming, and scaled from a backyard pond to a production facility, supplying major markets across the southeast. Fish farming is one of Nigeria's most underreported agricultural success stories. Catfish demand is enormous, and supply remains inconsistent. The episode taps into growing interest in agribusiness and the practical reality that agricultural investment can scale faster than most urban Nigerians realize. The emotional core of this episode is the weight of being a woman who came home without a husband or a Western success story, the quiet resilience of building in an industry people laughed at. The moment the first major contract arrives. Closing lesson: she didn't build a farm. She built a food supply. And she built it because she was willing to start where nobody wanted to look. Episode 3. He was deported from Italy. 5 years later, he became a property mogul. Emeka spent 7 years in Naples, working construction sites, and saving in ways that felt impossibly slow. When he was deported following a change in his visa status, he returned to Lagos with nothing, and the stigma of deportation, which in Nigerian social life carries a particular weight of shame. He channeled the skills he had learned on Italian construction sites into a small renovation business in Lagos, then into property development. Deportation is a reality that affects thousands of Nigerians annually, but it is almost never discussed honestly. An episode that addresses this directly, without exploitation, will attract enormous engagement from people who have either experienced it or know someone who has. The shame of the airport arrival, the silence at family gatherings, the moment he decides the story is not over. Closing lesson. He came home through the back door. He left through the front gate of his own estate. Episode 4. After 20 years in America, he started selling palm oil. Now he's worth millions. Biodun spent 20 years in Houston, working his way up from a security guard to a mid-level manager at a logistics firm. When he took early retirement at 52, he returned to Nigeria and started exporting traditional food products, palm oil, ogiri, egusi, to African diaspora communities in North America and Europe. What started as a side business became a multi-million-dollar export operation. This episode speaks to both the Nigerian diaspora market and the growing global appetite for authentic African food products. It also offers a narrative of patient wealth building over decades, something with huge resonance for middle-aged viewers. The loneliness of 20 years abroad, the identity crisis of returning as a stranger to your own country, the discovery that what home produces is exactly what the world wants to buy. Episode 5. The Taxi Driver. Everyone ignored, until he bought their street. Kunle drives taxis, first in London, then as an Uber driver in Lagos after returning home. Nobody takes him seriously. He wears the same clothes. He lives modestly. For 7 years he saves quietly, invests in land in Ikorodu, and when the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway expansion creates a land value surge, he sells at 10 times what he paid. He buys properties on the street where everyone once pitied him. This episode strips away the foreign return element and focuses purely on quiet, invisible wealth building. It will resonate with everyone who has ever been underestimated because of how they dress or what they do for work. The quiet dignity of being ignored. The discipline of living below your means when no one expects you to have means at all. The silence when people realize. Episode 6. She came back from Dubai with one suitcase. Today she employs 500 workers. Fatima spent 5 years in Dubai as a domestic worker, one of the least visible and least respected categories of Nigerian migrants abroad. She returned with savings, a deep understanding of the Gulf's service culture, and an idea to build a professional cleaning and facilities management company in Abuja that operated at the standard she had seen in Dubai. The company now holds government contracts and employs over 500 people. Domestic workers abroad are rarely centered as protagonists of entrepreneurial stories, yet they often return with savings, discipline, and skills that translate directly into business. This episode deliberately honors a demographic that is usually invisible: the indignity of the work, the private pride in doing it perfectly, the decision to take everything she learned and build something that belongs entirely to her. Episode 7. He left Germany with nothing, then built Nigeria's largest poultry farm. Rotimi had spent 6 years studying and working in Hamburg. He returned without a job offer or a clear plan, but with a deep knowledge of agricultural systems, how German farms were organized, how they maintained quality control, how they distributed product efficiently. He applied this knowledge to chicken farming in Ogun State, initially on a small plot, eventually scaling to a facility that supplies supermarkets and fast food chains across the Southwest. Poultry is one of Nigeria's most commercially significant agricultural sectors, with demand far outpacing local supply. An entrepreneurship story grounded in applied foreign knowledge, using what you learned abroad to transform a domestic industry, has both inspirational and educational value. Episode 8. Everyone called him a failure. Until he bought the company that rejected him, Dare applied to join a Lagos tech company at 26 and was rejected without explanation. Stung, he went abroad, worked in IT for 8 years, built his savings, returned to Nigeria, and spent 3 years quietly building a competing business. When the original company ran into financial trouble, Dare was in a position to acquire it. He did. This episode is the purest revenge narrative structure in the series, and it will generate enormous emotional engagement. The acquisition moment, the meeting where he sits across the table from the people who once rejected him, is the kind of scene that drives conversation, sharing, and rewatch behavior. Closing lesson. The best response to rejection is not anger, it's acquisition. Episode 9. He sold roasted corn after returning home, then became a millionaire. Chike returned from Ireland after 8 years with very little. Too proud to stay unemployed, but unable to immediately rebuild his career, he began selling roasted corn and pear, ube, on a busy road in Enugu. He used the small income to study commodity trading and eventually moved into trading agricultural commodities at scale, using the street vendor experience as market research. This episode is about the genius hidden in unglamorous work. Selling corn on the street requires understanding of customer behavior, supply, demand, seasonality, and